So welcome to another series of the Research Insights, the MC Forum. And today we have the pleasure to host Jan Krämer from University of Passau. And we're going to talk about a pretty hot topic, which is data sharing and access to the data and share between the big platforms and content providers. And what are the effects both on a strategic point of view. Without it, there would not be many of these services have been provided because there could be not possibility to enact upon information that is relevant to start with engage in an interaction with users or with other companies for producing services, or to gain some insights and knowledge on how to better target a particular service. In your study, Jan, so first of all, thanks, for being with us. Let's get into. It's a pleasure. But in your study, right? You talk about a particular tool or a particular way for data sharing, which is the social logins. What are, first of all, the social logins, and how does this data sharing for social login schema works?
No, thank you very much. First of all, for inviting me and giving me also the opportunity to talk a little bit about a paper that has been published already 2018 in Management Science. So it was back then the discussion about gatekeepers and data sharing and voluntary and maybe involuntary data sharing with the gatekeepers was not as acute as it is now. Also, and we have regulation now that we didn't have back then. And what we focused on as a leading example, so in the end, we have a theory model. So there's actually different ways also in which you can share data, and the model would be sort of agnostic to that, generally speaking. But the leading example and the way that we structure around it is, as you said, around the social logins. And social logins are basically single sign-on solutions where a provider that has a large user base, and our leading example was the login of Facebook at the time, which had, almost everyone had an account with Facebook, and you could use that login and that account data to log in also to new websites, new services that you didn't use before. And that's, of course, very convenient for you as a user because you don't have to provide the same login data everywhere. You can sign in very quickly. You don't have to provide, extra your name, your email address, and some other information. And it's also very convenient for the websites that use it, because it's just easier for users to sign up. They might get more reliable information. So you might, otherwise, if you register for the service for the first time, you don't know the service, you might give some bogus data, bogus name or bogus birth date or so, and you get actually more reliable information when you use this social login. And what's happening is that in the background, of course, then it's not only this one time that the login data is shared, but there might also be more data being shared in the background between the service provider, the website that is employing the social login, and thereby sort of getting easy access to the customer. But on the other hand, whoever is providing the login. And that can be data about when you're using that other website. So usually, for example, Facebook would have not known when you were using a service outside of Facebook. But because they were offering the social login, every time you log into that other service, they would see, oh, you've been using this service. You might be using this service very frequently. They might also be sharing on which specific categories on the website, which, subsites, which services you're using specifically on the site. In this paper, similar as to many other aspects of the platform economy, that the social login and the tools and services provided also by platforms are often increasing efficiency. And platforms are generally increasing efficiency. And that's a good thing. And also with the social logins in particular, it's who's benefiting. On the one hand, through increased data sharing, targeting rates go up. which is an efficiency gain. There's less wasted impressions, and not only on the side of the Facebook who offers the login, or any other service that offers the login, but also on the side of the independent websites that get more data. So targeting rates got up, less wasted impressions. That's an efficiency gain. On the other hand, consumers are better off because it lowers the transaction costs of using the service. So that's an efficiency gain for users. You might argue there's also some privacy loss potentially, but the very fact that users are using this and liking this seems that the efficiency gain for users is outweighing the privacy loss that comes with it, because a lot of times you don't have to use a social login. You still have the possibility also to register in the normal and other way. There's actually some services that require you to use, some social login, interestingly enough. The big question, and that's also similar as to other aspects we've been discussing in online platforms, is how is the efficiency gain being divided between the parties? And that is potentially more problematic, that ultimately most of the efficiency gain might be appropriated eventually by the platform and not so much by the complementers or those that have adopted sort of the offerings of the platforms. The websites in my example, they have two sources through which they can potentially improve their dealings coming from the social login. The one is an improvement in their targeting rate, so in how they make money, predominantly through advertisements, improvement in their targeting rate, which they're anticipating. And the other improvement is from sort of trying to evade the competition with other similar websites because they're offering a social login, so that users like that, so you can sort of draw in more users than you would have had otherwise. And when you consider, let's say you're the first one to adopt the social login, it's very tempting because you can make benefits on both fronts. You might even at that point be realizing that there is a cost associated with that it's not only your targeting rate that goes up, but it's also the targeting rate of Facebook that goes up. And then ultimately you're competing in sort of an advertising market, because ultimately it's a market for attention you're in, and then everyone is competing with everyone else in the digital economy. And if the targeting rate of Facebook goes up more than my own targeting rate, then the relative distance between these targeting rates is sort of increasing, which then makes me actually worse off, because I can make, advertisers will put less money on me and rather more money on Facebook, because they have increased their efficiency even more than I have. And this is where the loss is coming in. And you might even argue that a lot of the websites that we talk about, they're sort of special interests. So they're targeted to a particular group. Let's say you have a website, on sports gear or something like that, and then of course sports advertisers could sort of very easily do contextual advertisements as well, which means you don't really need so much data as maybe a Facebook, which is a general purpose website, a general purpose service, has a very diverse audience, and therefore needs to know a lot, could cater to a diverse set of advertisers, and therefore data is more valuable to them and could increase their targeting more. So that's the dilemma where it's coming from. Facebook is looking at purely from a data advertising perspective, whereas you're looking at, from these two components of utility, evading the competition with other websites and sort of increase in targeting rate. And you might be willing to accept even sort of a small loss in the advertising market, relative to the advertising market, because you're getting an even stronger gain in sort of evading the competition. But as others are also adopting the social login, that advantage and competition goes away. In a sense, the efficiency is still there. It's just dissipated to the users. But you as an independent website, as a complementer, you don't have that advantage anymore. And the other efficiency part predominantly goes to sort of the social login offerer, right? So efficiency never really goes away in that sense. It's just dissipated between the users, the adopters of these social logins, and the providers of these social logins. And it turns out that the adopters of the social login might get the smallest share after all.
The case from your study, your model, is that interestingly enough, right? I mean, so the fact that we're getting, this efficient market might create this asymmetry then between players, right? That gets to improve this efficiency. Therefore, some stands to win or benefit more from these efficiencies, and while the others might gain at the beginning and then later on might actually find themselves into a sort of a prisoner dilemma trap. However, not providing it at all, right, might actually lead to market failures. And
or not adopting,
yes,
right? So it's always both. You need to offer it and you need to adopt it, and only if both are happening we can reap these efficiencies. And as you say, from a total welfare perspective, so including users, the adopters of the social login, and the providers of the social login, if we take the sort of the sum of the welfares, for all of these, so the total efficiency, then a world in which we have a social login and it's actually being used is the best, because as I said before, it's creating efficiencies. The big question is, how do we divide these efficiencies? And there's where the problem comes in. And I would say it's a very typical problem with many platforms. Platforms in general bring a lot of efficiencies. That's why they are so popular, right? And then it's just a question of how to divide this between the users, the adopters, complementers of the platforms, and the platform itself. And there's this way you could start to regulate, of course, and say, there should be sort of side payments or whatever, and then you could rectify this prisoner's dilemma also, right? So you could, firms would not end up in a prisoner's dilemma if they would get a larger share of that efficiency. And potentially you could also rectify that the social logins would be adopted more often, or that would be offered more often, because, as you say, it can also be examples where maybe the offerer of the social login sort of thinks, well, I'm giving away too much data to others that are ultimately competing with me for advertisements. So the outflow of data is sort of a stronger cost to me than the benefit of the inflow of data I would be getting through the social login. So I'm not offering them at all.
Yeah.
Although empirical evidence is, also since we wrote the paper, is that these social logins have become more prevalent actually than they used to be. So there seems to be rather sort of not the market failure on offering them. Although maybe also as an add-on, we have an extension in the model where there is competing providers of social logins. And we can show that if there's competing providers of social logins, you might be tempted to offer these more often than is good for you. So it can also be that the providers of the social login actually end up in a prisoner's dilemma, because they're competing among each other for which social login are users actually then adopting ultimately, right? And that's a little bit maybe also what we see, that you can use Google or you can use Amazon or you can use Apple, but which one are you using as a user, right? And if you're another platform, do you want to miss out, or do you want to be among that list? And then you're tempted to provide a social login, even if maybe, because of competitive reasons as well, but maybe even if you think that you're giving away too much data to these independent third parties. So if we're actually in sort of this double prisoner's dilemma situation, then that would mean that most of the gains actually get dissipated to the user ultimately, which is good, because on the one hand, users have a choice which social login to use. They get sort of efficiency gains through better targeted advertisements, and they get efficiency gains through sort of lower thresholds for signing up for a service. So ultimately, in that situation, is the users that would gain the most if we set sort of privacy concerns or so a little bit aside, or think, these are lesser than the benefits that would come from these social logins. But it might also be that, what's not directly in the model, but what we also talk about and is a natural consequence is that websites that are adopting these sort of social logins and similar other tools that are being offered, maybe like fulfillment by Amazon, where you rely on services provided by the platform to sort of service your users, that you become dependent on the platform, and that it will be more and more difficult to revoke that initial decision again, right? So if you've chosen to sort of attract your users through a social login, then that's the way that users sign up. And if you at some point think, I don't want to use this anymore, I want to stop using the social login, then basically a lot of users that have used that as their means to log on to your service cannot log on to your service anymore. They lose their account data, or you would have to somehow try to transition them to a regular account, and you will be losing a lot of customers in the process. So you're creating a lot of dependency with the platform, and then you would also have something which is, in the telecom world, we've called this termination monopoly, that there might be a lot of competition between sort of these providers of social logins at face value, and you can choose, whether you adopt one of them or two or three or four. But once a user has made a decision, or once you've made a decision which one to adopt, then that's the choice you're stuck with, right? And then market power is being created over you because of that commitment that you've made. And because some users will then only be reachable through a specific login of a specific company, and that gives that company market power over you, right? And so that's also a common theme, I would say, in platforms, where there is some competition, and there's not only one provider, but two. But once you've made a choice, then there is sort of a lack of competition. Think about mobile ecosystems. We can all choose whether we want to be in the Apple world or the Android world. But once we've made our decision and bought an Android or Apple device, then that's the only way that service providers, developers can reach us through. And a similar thing is here. Once I've made my mind, whether I use Apple or Facebook or, some other Google as the means to access the service, then that's the way I access the service. This is where my account data lies. This is what I have to use from here on out to sort of access the service. And I have the same thing. I had, some services for some websites I have been using with my Facebook login, actually. And I'm not a Facebook user anymore, but I'm not deleting my Facebook account just because I would be losing access, login to these services. So that tells you a little bit how powerful and how sticky these decisions can be.
Are the companies doomed, or what strategy can they adopt, right? I mean, when companies are talking about the content providers, right, that are on the web, then knowing that there is this issue, right? So then, are they just at the mercy of this, big platforms or social login providers, or can they do, something to be a little bit more strategic? So, retain some of these gains, and knowing that there is, that inertia from the customer's point of view.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very tricky, and there's a good reason why platforms are so powerful, and also a good, especially for companies that are fresh and new and don't have an established customer base yet. Very attractive to use these kinds of tools and methods to gain a strong and quick foothold into the market. We all know that sort of digital markets are very dynamic and sometimes even short-lived. So in the short run, it seems very attractive to get access to as many users as possible, to get network effects going, to have an inflow of data, to improve your algorithms, to improve your services, to be more attractive, right? And you might be seeing these long-term risks, but it still might be tempting for you to use it in the short run, simply because in the long run, you might not exist anymore otherwise. So this is, I don't condemn the platforms for offering it, and I don't condemn anyone using it, but ultimately it creates this, as I said, this dependency and so on. So what can you do about it? Well, the first thing to realize is that to keep sort of choices alive and to keep also competition alive, there is an inherent cost that comes with it in the short run. It doesn't come for free. Think about, for example, in the DMA, the Article 6.2, which is about users having to opt in now specifically in the combination of data from different services offered by one provider. I mean, generally, it's a very good thing that providers combine the data of different services to offer me an even better service, right? But it also means I'm more stuck with whatever service I'm using because data is being combined, and it makes it even more difficult to sort of choose something else. Yeah? It creates a switching cost. But if you choose now not to combine data, that is a cost that you have. If you, as a provider that thinks about adopting these offers being made by the platform, like a social login, there is an immediate cost. It will be even harder to attract users to sign them up for your service. But ultimately, it's of course also very rewarding if you succeed, because then you're sort of independent and you're not reliant on that tool bit that's been given to you. You can more easily sort of have first-party data of those users in a sense. Some users might even prefer it because of privacy reasons, because they explicitly don't want to have, this super profile being created for them at some platform. You could also think about, instead of, adopting a social login that comes from a large platform that you might be ultimately competing with, you might be thinking about creating your own sort of login service that's independent and doesn't have the same commercial incentives in terms of exploiting user data. It's a sort of neutral arbiter. That's more, or you do something, as an industry, the websites themselves try to create sort of a login solution. And we've seen some of these attempts also in the wild, that companies like, I think Deutsche Telekom, for example, and BMW and others, they have been trying to sort of come up with their own identification login service. In many countries, it's the banks that have sort of a similar service that's being used. And they're not in the business for targeted advertisements, banks are. So they can be seen sort of as a trusted third-party intermediary. And then if you have the choice between using those services and those of a Facebook, then you might rather, as a website, opt for these independent services. And all the attempts so far to come up with sort of an independent, potentially even government-owned sort of identification service that's universally available have more or less failed for various reasons. One big reason is the lack of network effects. Some of these initiatives are very national, so they work well in Belgium, but they don't work well in Germany. Germans are very different anyway in terms of, when it comes to privacy than many other countries. Then in some countries like Finland and Estonia, you have a really good functioning national ID system that you can use for a lot. But then on the other hand, do you really want to tie every service you use online to your national identification card? And do you want to be more anonymous? So maybe then a Facebook is actually a more attractive alternative, because it gives you sort of an anonymous universal login in a sense, right? So you see, there's many, many, many problems with this. And in this void where we can't agree on anything else, and, governments are very slow to adopt and do things, and you cannot run a business just on being an independent social login provider or, login provider. In this void, the platforms fill this void very quickly. They have a lot of users. Everyone has an account with Google, with Facebook, or Instagram, or many have with Apple, and they're readily available. So this is what we use, and it's basically that the market speaks for itself. The market dynamics and all these considerations we have about national identification, independent identification services are basically overrun by the market reality.
You touch upon the regulation, the DMA. How do you see some of this more recent, regulatory initiatives to curb on the power of platforms to enlarge their domain, whether that is through the logins, right, or through other similar means where they gain more of this grip on users and they can leverage across a number of different services, and B, on the sharing or the split, right, of the distribution of the joint value, right? Mm-hmm. So do you see in some of those initiatives anything that target the specific dilemma and issues, and or on the other side, things that might actually make it even worse, right? That the dilemma becomes even more acute because of some of the specific regulation?
Yes. It's a very difficult question, precisely because of, on the one hand, the efficiency gains that are inherent in sharing data, and on the other hand, sort of these long-run competitive effects and also potentially effects on innovation that come with it, which are, of course, less tangible in a sense to assess. Also because of the missing counterfactuals in the long run assessment. So let's start with a question with a specific regulation that addresses this in the DMA and so on. And yes, there is. I mentioned already 6.2, which is sort of the combination of data coming from the same service of a platform, but that's not specific to sort of identification services per se. Although these identification services, which are also used for several services of one platform provider. So I use, the same login for Gmail, then I use maybe the login that I'm logged into when I do search and so on. So this is, if you will, like a first-party social login among my own services, and this is where 6.2 comes into play. But there's also Article 5.7 in the DMA, which prevents gatekeepers from requiring that end users or business users have to use their identification service. So to give them a little bit more leeway, although our paper was about voluntary adoption of these identification services, and both 6.2 and 5.7 point to the dilemma that even if you sort of say you can't make it mandatory to use these services, the identification services, social login, a lot of times users will want to use it, or business users will want to use it because they see these short-term efficiency gains coming from it, right? So just so as long as you still give the users a choice, a lot of times that regulation probably will not make a material difference in these regards. And precisely also because these gatekeepers, they're very good at getting consent from consumers, also because they have some good arguments for getting consent, because you just get a better service if you combine the data. Yeah, but it might come ultimately at the detriment of some competition and also some innovation, which is, however, not as tangible as the immediate benefit. So it's a very similar prisoner's dilemma, basically, that the users might be on, just might not even be aware of it. On the other hand, so that is sort of with respect to these two types of regulation. On the other hand, I view sort of these social logins very skeptically for the reason of basically, let's say, successive monopolies or successive entry into new markets by platforms. So I personally don't view it as a problem that a platform dominates any single market. And it's also, I think, inevitable because of the strong network effects, both direct and indirect network effects that are going on, that if you think about a search engine, maybe it is efficient that we're all using Google for the time being as our search engine, because there's a lot of efficiency coming with that. What I view much more problematic is that the next big thing that emerges and the big thing after that and sort of adjacent markets are also being typically dominated by the same firms. I personally would prefer if it were other firms that would conquer and master and dominate potentially these markets, because the domination aspect, again, we can't get rid of. But social logins allow it, and the data sharing that comes with it more generally allows it to sort of monitor and get data from markets which you're not even competing in. Right? So you're getting data from markets in which you're not immediately innovating. You're just sucking out the data in a sense, but you're not giving the same competition innovation benefits to these markets. It might also allow you to sort of monitor very early on which markets are more successful, to have sort of a good radar, because you see, hey, there's a lot of users using my login for this particular service, and they're logging in, 6 times a day. So this is something we should be going into, which then prevents independent new competitors to emerge and also come up to scale and potentially put some more competitive pressure and also innovation pressure on the big incumbents that we already have that are offering these services.
We might have some competition between these platforms. Nonetheless, they might still foreclose perhaps opportunity for yet other players to come up and build their own big platform. So
Right.
we might get to a more competitive inter-platform scenario where still the players are few and the same, right, of today. Although we also have, witnessed new players emerging and building on this, data sharing, and so this piggy, piggyback strategy on existing platforms.
Yeah,
but,
well, I mean, there's not so many new players.
No, of course,
there's not so many new players, and of course, I mean, there's an argument that's often been made, and there's of course some truth to it that it's also a few players that can compete fiercely. On the other hand, there's also quite elaborate empirical history on multi-market contact and collusion. So if the same players repeatedly meet in sort of several different markets, they don't tend to compete as heavily as if they were independent and just
they build the so-called sphere of influence, right? So
yes,
they remain, right? They understand
so
that they have their own domain, and so they will not attack each other to the other core domains of the other company.
There's several theories about that. There's also quite a lot of empirical evidence, and mostly coming from the airline industry market, which is similar. But nevertheless, I mean, so it's not so clear that this is a better world. And if you ask me, I think I don't mind some champions in some which I think is inherent, but I would like to see, and if you look in the last 20 years, and the very things that the big platforms used to gain dominance, and the very sort of flux in the market and possibilities are less there today. And just as a general observation, that is something that worries me a little bit. And also when it comes to the DMA, it actually didn't take a good stance on this issue, because there are some provisions in there that seem to suggest that we want to supplant the incumbent, right? So it's replacing sort of existing services. And then there's some few other things that are looking more into sort of this dynamic dominance of adjacent markets, keeping adjacent markets open. But it's not very meticulously designed and say, we favor one approach over the other. Some things are, 611, for example, is about data sharing of a search engine with other search engines.
Exactly. So it seems to be that sometimes it's substitution of one for the other, but not.
So what would be much better, also coming from the model, is, it would be much better if there's data sharing of the dominant search engine with whoever wants that data, right? Not only other search engines.
Yeah.
Yes. So it's as I said, it's the key aspect is, in a sense, that we'll have to take short-term efficiency losses to make long-term efficiency gains, which are a little bit less tangible because they would come through more competition and more innovation. And if we don't do so, we will never have the counterfactual, right? Because we don't have a time machine and go back in time what would have happened, if we didn't do it. But we would need a time machine to make those sort of long-term efficiency gains tangible. And that's difficult to sell to users. It's difficult to sell to some of the, complementers that are in the market now and not tomorrow. Yeah, maybe. Right. And it's difficult also to sell to politicians and policymakers sometimes.
Right. So yes to champions, but please more champions, if I were to summarize.
Excessive monopolies, a very Schumpeterian sort of idea, but not in the same market, in sort of different markets, and they keep on popping up in digital.
The markets of tomorrow, the future. So thank you, Jan. And this was a conversation and a chat with Jan Krämer for University of Passau on research insights from one of his studies, Winners, Losers, and Facebook, the role of social logins in the online advertising ecosystem. Thanks, Jan, for being with us and sharing your knowledge.
Thank you very much for having me.